In the next module, we will now turn our attention to the strategic models, namely the MRI or brief model and the strategic model of J. Haley and Chloe Madonis. Refer back to your notes on the origins of these models as a means to note both the similarities and the differences, as well as to note how they each evolved ideologically. Now, let's join the workshop.
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the strategic models. And when we think of the strategic models, immediately something changes in our perspective. So yesterday we talked, when we approached the transgenerational models, we talked about models that used what kind of change? Continuous or discontinuous change? Continuous change, which meant that it was incremental and it was based upon insight. Now we're moving into the world of engineering, and we can engineer change. And one of the things that perhaps many of you have realized is that once you understand the strategic therapies, and remember I did that umbrella yesterday that showed all the strategic therapies, and then we had MRI, we had Milan systemic, and we had Haley strategic underneath that. What the strategic therapists allow us to do is to really have a discontinuous kind of change. Let me give you an example of a discontinuous kind of change. When I was, after I graduated from college, I worked as a mental health worker in Butler Hospital. Remember I talked about the catacombs and everything? Well, back in '78, in the East, we had something called the Blizzard of '78. And the Blizzard of '78, we had literally snowdrifts of 25 feet. And Butler Hospital was sort of in the epicenter of the whole thing. So I mean 25 feet of snow. It was amazing. Well, it turned out that day, actually I'd been taking my grandfather to the doctor. And so he and I trudged through the snow, and I got him back home. But I had to go in for a 4 o'clock shift on the day of the blizzard. And the blizzard really started about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I got in for my shift, and then I got stuck in the hospital for 10 days. Okay, in a very large psych hospital, the only shift of people on, and we weren't, and none of the psychiatrists were there except for the on-call people because it wasn't the first shift. So something really interesting happened. That as we had to work 3 shifts, day after day after day, and as we started to decompensate, and we certainly did, all the patients started taking over our roles. With the exception of passing out medication. But what was fascinating was that after the 10 days, the whole ward cleared. Everybody went home. Everybody got better. Isn't that amazing? Even Susie, the little catatonic lady that had been stuck at the beginning of it, she started moving. She started talking. And they were getting, in a sense, less treatment than they were with the hospital in full swing. This is an example of discontinuous change. Some kind of external or some kind of profound event occurs. Now, when I teach in Florida, I oftentimes have lots of folks that experienced Hurricane Andrew. And Andrew in Florida was like these hurricanes we were experiencing, like Ike, like Katrina, has been so profound for people. And everybody has a story about how their lives have changed in Florida when they experienced Andrew. I'm sure people in Louisiana have huge stories about how their lives have changed and how they've used it hopefully as an opportunity to make some changes in their lives. And hopefully, someday people that are experiencing Ike are going to have a way to look at sort of how this allowed them for some change, even though the devastation obviously is beyond words. But what I really want to pay attention to, want you to pay attention to here, is that when we're dealing with strategic models, we're always looking at the fact that the engineer, the therapist, is an engineer of the solution. If our building fell down on us, right around us, who would we hold accountable? The structural engineer or the architect. Okay? So who's responsible for change in the strategic models? The therapist. Whereas who's responsible for change in the transgenerational, more continuous kinds of models? The actual client system themselves. Okay? So we are in these models taking sort of the notion of change, and we are saying we have the capacity now to engineer and to create change. And those of you that have some strategic training, I'm sure you recognize that you can create anybody's situation with anyone where change can occur. It's very, very easy to double bind, to paradox, to prescribe a symptom. you know, it's very easy to somehow set things up where people will be forced to change. And these are the models that really sort of develop that. So what's similar about the models? Some of the things that are similar are that they're all cybernetically based. What does that mean exactly, that they're cybernetically based? They're paying attention to some of the elements that relate to communication, to feedback loops, to how family systems or systems in general self-regulate. Okay? And that we're looking at now that behavior is the information we're looking at. Are we taking a look at the family of origin and what has gone on in this family for year after year? No. It's really now focused on what? What's in front of us, the here and now. Okay? So almost the behavior in the room or what the client's presenting. The goal is what? To solve the presenting problem. Is it much else? No. Are we going to have this interesting foray into the psyche of, no, we're not. Well, we're just going to be looking at what the client system is presenting us. And we're emphasizing positive feedback loops. Now, what does that mean, to emphasize a positive feedback loop?
Create change.
We're going to create change, meaning what?
We're going to excite the system, so
it's going to have to sort of reorganize itself. It's going to have some what we called it yesterday, negative entropy. We're going to introduce the capacity for negative entropy or negentropy, which is the tendency for a system to become more complex. Okay, because we're going to give more information to that system. Okay, so the major concepts when we go to MRI, okay, are as follows: that the family is involved in a vicious cycle of mishandled attempts to solve the problem. What does that mean? A vicious cycle of mishandled attempts to solve the problem. Any idea?
Problems becomes the problem.
Okay. The attempted solution becomes the problem. So the definition in MRI is that the attempted solution is now the problem. With my clients, I do a little exercise with them where when I see them repeating themselves over and over again, in terms of trying to solve the problem the same way, and it continues to not work, what I tend to do is I say, okay, I'm going to do a little experiment with you, and I'd like you to get up, and I get my client to stand up. And I said, now, see that closed door over there? I want you to actually see if you can, and this will sound crazy, but just try to walk through that door without opening the door. Okay? And so I take them over to the door, and they say, no, I can't do it. I said, well, of course you can't do it. Come back here and do it. Let's try it again. Okay? Now, I'm not going to do it this time with you. You're going to do it yourself, but I want you to run full force at that door. Okay? That's what happens with the attempted solution. We try more of the same. A great example of it is, any of you traveled to Europe or other places? Ever notice Americans, do we sort of stand out in Europe? Mm-hmm, yeah. And why do we stand out? When we try, well, first of all, we try to speak English to everybody. Okay? We don't speak or attempt to speak native languages often. And what happens when someone doesn't sort of understand what an American is saying to them? You speak louder. Sort of, right? If I talk louder, then they're going, okay. It's kind of silly. But that's still the attempted solution. It becomes the problem. The problem is that we're not stepping back and really looking at how we're attempting to solve whatever the issue is.
It's like the metaphor for insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
The metaphor for insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. Yes.
Expecting different results.
Expecting different results, doing the same thing over and over again. Yep, exactly. But that's the hallmark of the MRI or the Palo Alto model. Okay, that the attempted solution is the problem, becomes the problem. And so, what is our job with our? Now, listen to the jargon. With our customer, do we call clients in the MRI model? No, we call them customers. Okay, so we come in and work with a family, and the family presents with a problem. That is the problem we are looking at. We're looking at nothing more than the presenting problem they bring us. Okay? So families establish a pattern really overreacting or underreacting to whatever the problem is, and they repeat it over and over again. Okay? So we now talk about a little bit about things like first and second order change. Okay? Because that's one of the hallmarks of the MRI model and also the strategic models. Okay? So can someone give me an example of first order change? What is first order change? Change in the behavior. Okay? So it's change at a behavioral level. Do MRI or strategic therapists ever sort of prescribe in their treatment first order change? Yes, of course they do. Of course they do. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, I want you to try this. When you go home, instead of nagging your daughter to do her homework, I would like you to just make a nice meal for her, okay, and not nag her, and just give her some space. And the client system may say, okay, I'll do that. That's just prescribing behavior. It's more than fine. However, what this model has offered us is the ability to use paradox. And do we remember where paradox comes from? Do we remember? I sound like a nurse in a hospital. Do we remember? Do you remember? Milton Erickson, yes. Milton Erickson brings what? He brings the whole ability to bypass resistance. Okay? So one of the huge boons in this model, the MRI model, is that we can now get by resistance. We're not bound to just have to fight the resistance that the customer system is presenting us. We can bypass it. We can jump over it. And how do we do that? We use things like paradox. Okay? And we use things, and can someone give me some examples of some paradoxical interventions that the MRI model might use? Go ahead.
When you can't sleep, get up and scrub the floor.
Okay, and what?
Oh, no, that's an ordeal.
Okay, that would be more of an ordeal, which would have certainly a strategic element to it. But when we think of ordeal, what model do we think of? Strategic Haley. Madonnas, Chloe Madonnas. Okay, so but that's a different model than MRI. It's under the same umbrella, but right now let's stay focused on MRI. So things that are paradoxical, interventions that are paradoxical, are things like restraint of change, do more of the same, you're changing too fast, go slow, right? So we're using techniques, odd day, even rituals can sometimes, be somewhat strategic in what their sort of purposes are. Okay. So what we're trying to do with the MRI model is that we're really trying to sort of identify what the attempted solution is, what the vicious cycle is, and then what do? We then use a lot of the strategic techniques if first order change doesn't occur. Yes.
So with that example that you just gave, you would tell the mom to nag even more than usual?
So with the example of a mom that's nagging her daughter, if we were to use a paradoxical intervention, which begins to sort of bridge us over to second order change, okay, and again, second order change is what? A change in the belief system or the rules, okay, change in the belief system or rules, then yes, we would have the mom nag the daughter more, saying you're not nagging enough, okay, and that becomes then that strategic sort of element that pushes it to a point of, say what? What do you mean? Nag her more? And there's a little bit of confusion. Now, one of the hallmarks that I find when using the MRI model is that my tongue is always in my cheek, so to speak. Okay? That I'm being a little, I'm saying things that are kind of ridiculous. But in saying things that are a little bit ridiculous with a straight face, I'm really encouraging the client to do something a little bit out of the ordinary. Here's a example that Václavic used to give. He would say that there was a person that came to him that was having trouble finishing their dissertation. And so Václavic said to the person, well, I hear what your problem seems to be, and what I'd like you to do for the next week, every day at lunch, I'd like you to go down to the local Chinese restaurant. Is there a Chinese restaurant nearby? The person said, yes, there is. Okay, I'd like you to go there and have lunch there every day. Okay? When you go there, I'd like you to order some form of Mexican food while you're there, every day. Okay? That'll be all for today. Thank you very much. Where's my money? Okay? The point being is that it was to bypass what? The whole notion that the person is approaching writing their dissertation in a way that is not going to yield results. And so they're coming up with an intervention that's going to challenge and add some confusion. Because remember, when we're talking about we talk about positive feedback loops. Okay? What are we trying to do? We're trying to introduce more complexity. What do we have to break oftentimes before we can introduce more complexity? The homeostasis, the negative feedback loops, that which keeps things the same.
I think I found that it's very effective with anxiety, people who are having panic attacks. To tell them, like, next time you come in, we're going to have a panic attack when you're here.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, well, I don't think I can have a panic attack when I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
And so it causes that confusion in their mind. They're like, oh my gosh, what do you mean?
Yep.
How can I have a panic? How can I plan a panic attack?
Well, okay, and so what you're talking about, which is very important, is this notion that by planning planning the symptom, in a sense, what is the therapist doing when they're planning a panic attack with a client? They are what? They're, first of all, prescribing the symptom, okay? They're prescribing the symptom. And in prescribing the symptom, what do you do? First off, you take control of the symptom, and you put yourself in a win-win situation with your client, okay? If they listen to you, what happens? Well, okay. If they don't listen to you, they don't have a panic attack, okay? So in doing so, you've created a situation which is a therapeutic double bind. So a therapeutic double bind is the introduction of a win-win scenario. Okay, exactly as you're talking about. The other thing that, I always remind my clients is that when they come in, they talk about anxiety, and which of us doesn't have a little anxiety, and sometimes people have a lot. But I let people know that of all the things they could have possibly gotten, it's like having a phobia. I say, you got the best one. You're so lucky you don't have something else. And clearly, because we can do something about that. And do you know that no one's ever died from anxiety or panic? No one has ever died. Because panic or anxiety only gets so high. And what happens when anxiety gets so high? After a point, it drops off. Every time it reaches its peak, the next time up, it gets to a lower and lower and lower point and will extinguish itself. And so, exactly as you're saying, you encourage people to experience their anxiety. What can we do in here to make you more anxious? Okay? I don't think you're actually anxious enough at the moment. This is the model that's, again, really going to take charge of what the presenting symptom is. So we talked yesterday about the idea that communications have rules, right, and that there's a report and a command element to every communication. And so the rules oftentimes are really defined by the command element of a communication. Okay? And the command element, do you remember yesterday when we talked about it? The command element speaks to what? The relationship between the sender and the receiver. Okay? It speaks to the, and therein lies the rules of the relationship. Now, this is the model that really emphasizes the classic double bind. And does everybody remember what Bateson talked about as being the 4 conditions that need to be met? 4 conditions necessary for the classic double bind. Monty, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, you can't leave.
Okay, so the first one condition is that you're bound to the field. Okay, you can't leave. You're bound to the field. Okay?
That my mind could go. I just went into the double bind.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll help you a little bit. You're bound to the field. There's a double message. Okay. There's a double message, which means that there are conflicting messages, oftentimes with content and command elements. Okay. The third part is that the receiver is unable to comment on the message, and that it's an emotionally. Last one is that it's an emotionally important relationship. Okay, so you're bound to the field. There's a double message. There's a contradiction between the command and the report. The receiver is unable to comment on that double bind. And it's an emotionally important relationship. So, Bateson's classic example is as follows. Johnny is schizophrenic, and he's hospitalized. Okay, Mom comes in to visit Johnny. Mom sees Johnny walking down the hall. Johnny sees Mom. Mom comes out and says, Johnny, come give your mother a hug. Warily, Johnny walks up to Mom, gives Mom a hug. as mom is hugging Johnny and Johnny hugging mom, mom stiffens. Johnny pulls back. Mom says to Johnny, "What's the matter? Don't you love your mother?" Okay, that's the classic example of the double bind. And remember, what did we say yesterday about whether or not this is the basis for schizophrenia, which was Bateson's point? It is not. Schizophrenia is genetically based. Okay, there's a genetic causation. One of the things that this model also talked about, again, I mentioned it yesterday. Yes, Victor?
What do you mean by bound to feel?
You're bound to feel. He could never not be his mother's son.
I see.
Okay, that relationship is always going to be that fact. He may decide not to deal with her, but he's always going to be her son. He's bound to. There's no way to leave. Okay, that part of the relationship. This is also a model, if you remember, that talked about the utopian syndrome, which comes from Václavic's work or his book called Change. Okay, remember that list you're keeping of all the major theorists in their books. Okay, change is a very important one. That's what really this model is about, is generating change. Now, one of the things that I do when I look at therapies, and let me just get a board up here and draw for a second. Marker. One of the things that I think about, and as we're starting to sort of really move into the strategic models, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that there are different, if you will, stages that one can think about of therapies, and the different models sometimes fall into different stages. There's a question in terms of how do we sort of organize all the models on continuums for that one sheet of paper that you're going to be working towards downloading when you go sit for the actual exam. This is one thing that you might consider. Okay, the first stage that really all therapies have to deal with on some level or not is the whole notion of symptom relief. Okay. And symptom relief happens, it's something that from the strategic models is actually quite easy, isn't it? Can't we, if someone comes in with a symptom, can't we prescribe the symptom? Can't we take control of the symptom? We can engineer it. Okay? So that models like MRI, Haley, Milan not being a therapy, it's a meta-consultation, okay? But they can still work towards getting rid of symptoms. What other models really focus on getting rid of the symptom? Behavioral, solution-focused. Yep, narrative. Okay. So you can make a list of all the models, okay, that really focus on symptom relief. Now, what happens though is that oftentimes, that's transformation. Oftentimes, that getting rid of a symptom doesn't necessarily change everything. You can get rid of, and now the MRI model believes, and this is a really important tenet to the MRI model, that if we get rid of the symptoms, if we generate some kind of positive feedback loop and the system has to reorganize around the changes, that the system will organize in a more sophisticated, more effective way that will resolve the problem that people came in with, and the system will be better for it. Okay? That's sort of the underlying sort of theory of change, if you will, for the MRI and for the Haley model as well. Okay? What ends up happening in Milan, too, and what ends up happening, though, is there's a leap of faith that the system will somehow be better for it. It's true of solution focus, too. Okay? Now, other models, however, are more transformational. And when you deal with transformational aspect of a therapy, you're dealing with what? You're focusing on family of origin issues, on the couple system. Okay, you're moving. So that Haley, because he's moving into the couple system, he would move over towards this transformational stage, where you're actually looking for more insight. Okay, so this is where we have, over here, we have the discontinuous change. Right, discontinuous. And then we have continuous change. So in the old days, when insurance companies paid for therapy for a long period of time versus sort of how they pay for therapy now in solution-focused, right? We used to be able to get rid of the symptom. Then we would actually move into transformation, and we would work with family of origin issues, and we would do a much more elaborate therapy. And then, I don't know if you've ever heard of this stuff, but we could do something called prevention. Insurance companies would pay for prevention. And they'd actually let us predict the next normative developmental crisis that the family's going to be encountering, and in sort of Peggy Papp's words, do some fast future tracking and sort of have the family really develop a sense of how they're going to handle the next normative crisis. Okay? So one of the things that you might want to do with all your models in terms of your preparation in that one sheet is begin to sort of put which of the models. We know Bowen's over here, right? We know object relations. We know contextuals over here. Okay? Behavioral is working just on sort of the actual behavior. Narrative would move over here in terms of the sort of restoring, okay, and reconnecting to community, and would even move over to here because they're really hoping that people move over to that whole preventative realm as well about having the community and retribalizing. Okay, so but one of the things I would ask you to do is really think about the models that just focus on symptom relief, the models that actually have transformation. And where would structural be? Transformation. Okay. Okay. Network therapy. It would almost be. I would put network sort of right here, right? Because I think they're kind of bridging. Okay. But the point is, these are the kinds of maps you want to make for yourself on your sheet of paper where you're starting to organize all the models. Okay? So the strategic models we're talking about right now are really dealing with symptom relief. And they're just that first stage of change or of working with families. Yes?
Look at Haley again, just in the transformational part, how he goes both ways.
With Haley, because he starts moving into the executive system, so Haley starts with, and we'll talk about this in just a second when we shift over to Haley, but he starts with sort of what the presenting problem is, okay? And he goes through that whole process of, if you will, of the structured initial interview. And so Haley starts there, and then he moves it ultimately to the executive system because he believes that problems ultimately, and this is the transformational component of his model, have a faulty executive system, and he's going to sort of rework that hierarchy. Remember, Haley hierarchy. That he got from Mnuchin, yes. Okay. So, let me go back up here a little bit. Okay. So I just want to go through all of these important components. So, first order change is change in behavior. Second order change is change in the belief system and rules, and this model the MRI model goes at both. Okay? If you can't just change the behavior, you'll bypass it and jump into a second order change. Okay? The attempted solution is the problem. Okay? You look for the most motivated person in the system. Okay? That's one of the assessment tools you're using. Okay? We're going to create more sort of information for the system, and the system's going to have to reorganize based on the new information, the input that we're going to put in, which is the positive feedback loop. Does change occur inside or outside of the session? Outside of the session. Okay? So with the MRI model, change occurs outside the session, which means there's oftentimes going to be homework. Now, what's the importance of the life cycle transition points in this model? Life cycle. And when I say life cycle, what do I mean, first off?
Developmental changes of the stages of change in the family.
Okay, so yes, the family life cycle. The family life cycle. Now, again, who do we think of when we talk about family life cycle? Who jumps to mind? Monica McGoldrick. Okay, and where is she these days? Ackerman. She used to be at Philadelphia Child Guidance. She's now in Ackerman. Okay, now, Monica McGoldrick. We also think of Monica McGoldrick when we think of ethnicity and family therapy, and feminist family therapy now too. But ethnicity and family therapy. By the way, quick aside, everybody should have a copy of Ethnicity and Family Therapy on their bookshelves. And for this exam, everybody should get a copy of Ethnicity and Family Therapy. Why? There are definite questions that you will find on this exam that clearly will speak to different ethnic groups. You need to have a good understanding of how to work loosely with different ethnic groups, okay, and some of the characteristics of the different ethnic groups. Off the top of my head, the ones I would pay attention to certainly would be making distinctions between West Indian and African American, okay, in terms of Chinese, Japanese, Mexican Americans, Filipino, Italian, Irish, Jewish, WASP. Okay, you really need to know, us WASPs, you got to watch out for us WASPs too, in terms of just the way our families are organized. Okay, and there are different ways you work with families. For instance, just a quick aside, if you're working with an Italian family, who do you talk to first? The father. If you're working with an Irish family, who do you talk to first? The mother. The mother. Definitely the mother. Okay? All the power is held by the mothers in Irish families. Okay? But these are the things you need to know. And so definitely read the small chapters on these different ethnic groups before you take the test. And it's a great book to have anyway. They have usually a 20-page chapter on a different ethnic group. One time I had an Iranian family come to see me. I didn't really know much about the family and the ethnic group, and learned that I needed to get permission from the father to talk to anybody in the family. And so every time I wanted to ask the daughter a question, I'd have to ask the father permission to talk to the daughter. But it allowed me to engage with the family. Okay? Great book to have. Okay, so where we are is that we're talking about the family therapy or the family life cycle. And just a quick sort of treatise on life cycle. What are the stages of the family life cycle? Okay, let's start with why adolescence? How old are your children? How old are your children? Let's start with an unattached adult. Okay, let's start with the unattached adult. Okay, so that's the first stage. Okay, and then we go to beginning marriage, and from every stage there's a node, right? There's a node. We have to make a shift. Okay, so any of us remember, what it was like when we first moved in with our partner, and that bliss and everything that we experienced, and then all of a sudden we had to decide which way does the toilet paper go, up or down? Toothpaste cap on or off? How do we, who cooks, who cleans? How does this all get worked out? We have to make some real shifts, don't we, in terms of the way we've always done things, and now we have to start accommodating. Okay, so we have that, but that node requires us to, in a sense, actually deconstruct our belief system or the way we do things and be open to the next. And at every node from one developmental stage to the next, there has to be that kind of regressive deconstruction of what has been, and the new information, okay, the positive feedback loop, which is again why it comes out of the MRI model here, gets brought back into the picture and we reorganize accordingly. And obviously, the theory of dysfunction is what for then the MRI model?
Having difficulty making those adjustments.
That problems emerge at these developmental life cycle nodes when the family is not able to generate the positive feedback loop that then allows the family to reorganize to the next level of complexity. Unattached adult, beginning marriage. Okay. Then we have early childhood when the first child's born. Okay. And then we have school-aged, right, when the child goes off to school. And what happens is that all of a sudden there's a window into your house. I'll tell you a quick story where I had a client who had left a drink in their refrigerator. They hadn't finished it, of orange juice and vodka, and that client ended up the wife came in, I think, and put it in the sippy cup and sent it off to daycare. So the teacher called the family and said, I think there's a problem with the drink. And unfortunately, the teacher knew the family and it was not a big deal. However, all of a sudden that family has a window that's been opened up into, well, someone was drinking vodka and orange juice at home last night. And so the whole point of the matter is that we start, kids tell stories, they tell what's going on, we get a lot more information coming back into the family, where up until that point, as a couple, you're fairly insular as a couple system or a family system. Then we move, so we go to school-aged, and then we go to what? Adolescence. And what happens at adolescence? How does the family have to change from school-age to adolescence? The rules have to become much more flexible, exactly. And we also have the whole issue of the adolescent and their developmental stage being, I am not my parents. Okay? So there's a lot more potential for conflict, and the family has to adjust and change their capacity to integrate some of that new information coming back from the adolescent, and also what comes home with the adolescent. Alcohol, drugs, sex, friends, all sorts of other things now start coming into the family that have never come into the family possibly before. After that stage, we have the launching stage, and the launching stage has to prepare that adolescent for young adulthood and to begin their whole family life cycle. We launch the kids, and then there's the next node of empty nest. Okay? Which some of us are looking forward to. And what ends up happening there is that all of a sudden now we're back in a sense to that beginning family stage, right? The beginning marriage stage, where the couple perhaps has put off a lot of their relationship because they've been so busy rearing children and launching them and being successful as parents. All of a sudden they start looking at each other across the kitchen table and saying, who are you again? Oh, yeah.
Or even ignoring relationship problems.
Which is why many times divorce happens at this stage and where else? Beginning family, when the first child's born. Okay? Divorce rates increase because it really challenges the system if it hasn't really met the full developmental tasks of the family life cycle at that stage. So we have then empty nest, and then we have what? What's after empty nest?
Middle age.
Sort of the older family, or older couple system, as they start preparing. They start.
Is there in between where your children marry?
Well, there's actually I'm sorry, I forgot retirement. There's the retirement phase of the family life cycle, okay, and the retirement phase is where our life goals start changing, and we start sort of slowing down, and physically we start slowing down. And we start re-examining, okay, now we have, next 20 years, 15 years, X amount of years together. And then we have old age, which is marked by one partner dying, okay? But that's the family life cycle, okay? And at every node, it stresses the system, and the system has to adapt accordingly, okay? Now, back to MRI. MRI believes that it's very, very important to sort of look at those points where the life cycle stage is shifting because problems emerge there. So the theory of change then with this model is that we're looking to do what? We're trying to change what's called the interdependent nature of the symptoms that are complementary. In other words, that's the circularity that holds it together, the recursiveness, the homeostasis. So this is a model that is geared towards what? Changing homeostasis, okay, which is the negative feed. So the problem in this model are the negative feedback loops, which is what keeps the homeostasis in place. And change is what? Change is sort of based on how the positive feedback loops then change it. Okay? And we're looking to change the vicious cycle. Whenever we hear the word vicious cycle, we think only of this model. Okay? Stages of therapy tend to be that you introduce a treatment setup in terms of how this is going to work. It's going to be a brief therapy. Let's say we treat the symptom. Someone comes in and, I don't know, Johnny doesn't want to go to school. And we get Johnny to go to school. However, we do it with our strategic techniques or just coming up with a strategy for Johnny to make it to school. What ends up happening? We are done with therapy when Johnny goes to school. But what if in the midst of it we see that mom and dad have a horrendous relationship and actually mom is a little emotionally abusive towards dad? What do? We stop therapy because Johnny went to school. Okay? This is not a model where we then use our ability to assess the family across broader spectrums and then design further treatment goals. We do not. It's only what the customer, not the client, what the customer has asked us to focus on. Now, if the customer recontracts with us, can we go and do something else? Sure, but they have to recontract with us. But this is why this is such a brief model, because we're just focusing on getting rid of the symptom. And as engineers, this is a model that very much allows us to make change quickly. I like to call this the fast food model. Okay, this is sort of like the drive-through model of therapy. Okay, you come in, you order what you want. By the time you hit the window, it's there. Okay, this is the model where you present with a problem. Something happens in the kitchen of therapy. Something's cooking in terms of intervention. You get to the window, the intervention happens, the behavior changes, you're done. Okay, it's a very quick model, very focused. Okay, so what ends up happening is that you define the problem, you look for that vicious cycle, you set goals, and you start making sort of interventions, and you terminate. Very straightforward model, but very powerful. It's important. It's a very important model to have sort of in your therapy tool bag, because there are times when you clearly need to just get right to getting rid of the symptom before you can do anything else. But they would say, at that point, if you're speaking strictly from this model, you're done. Stance of the therapist is very active. You can clearly tell that the therapist is in charge. Why? Because they're taking full responsibility for the change. We're focusing more on what we see going on, less on what's being said. And we're just intervening right where we feel we need to intervene. This is where the one-way mirror began in many of the supervision and training programs, and certainly when I first trained back in the late 70s, this was how we were trained, behind a one-way mirror. This is a good time for me to just sort of branch off and talk about one-way mirrors and teams, because we're introducing the notion of team. And when we think of teams, we mentioned a couple yesterday. Do you remember what they were? The reflecting team, and what else? This will be the straight direct interventional team, and then there's the Milan team. Okay? So when we think of teams in general, we think of one-way mirrors. Anyone worked with a one-way mirror before? Okay? Wonderful training device, great sort of experience in terms of having people watching you work and giving you interventions and feedback on the spot. And this MRI team is a very, what I call a sort of just a straight interventional team. Here's our one-way mirror, and we have a team behind the mirror. We have a family. Okay? And then we have a therapist. A direct interventional team may have a telephone inside that the team then uses on the other side, and they call directly to the therapist and give the therapist direction as to what they're doing. I want you to, a good example of that is, I once worked with a client who had 5 children. She was like 22 years old. It was a really dangerous situation. The kids were sort of killing animals. It was, really, as we know, that doesn't bode well in terms of sociopathic behavior. And the mother was a prostitute. And so what I did is I brought the whole family in, and then I had my team behind me. And David Cantor was supervising me behind the mirror, and he pulled me out of the session. And, in David's inimitable way, he puts his arm around me, and we're walking behind the mirror, back and forth. And David ends up, and he says, "Rob, I want you to make the father cry, the grandfather cry. I'll get back in there and do it." That was all the direction he gave me. And so I've got, these 5 kids in the room, and I've got the grandmother and grandfather and the mom. And so the grandfather's mad at the mother because she's not taking care of the kids. And so I focused on the granddad, and I said, so can you remember the very first time? And I got up and I said, and put my arm on the mom's shoulder, that you held your daughter in your arms when she was a little baby? Because he was so mad. And immediately he softened and cried. A direct interventional team. Okay? The supervisor behind the mirror is kind of running the therapy. I'm sort of doing what he tells or she tells me to do. Okay? That's a direct interventional team. Now, we talked about a reflecting team yesterday. And just as quickly, what we'll try to do is just sort of give you all three teams, and then we'll talk about them as they come up in the models. You'll have a reference point. A reflecting team, originally, Tom Anderson, who's from where? Norway, ended up sort of having teams watching and doing some kind of a direct interventional. And what ended up happening was we had a family behind here that was also being seen by a therapist, seeing the family. Okay. We all know the properties of one-way mirrors, how they work. Okay. You turn the light off on one side, they can't see through the mirror. You turn the light on both sides, you can kind of see through the mirror, so you can switch it. What he did was he had speakers set up on both sides, and the family and the therapist did a little bit of an interview, and then they stopped. They turned the lights off, and they turned the lights on the team, and then we had the team talking about the family. Now, with a reflecting team, the key notion of a reflecting team is that in order to ever make a comment as a team member about something you see going on in the family, you need to contextualize your statement. If I'm on the team, what I would then say is, as the oldest son of a family of 5 children, I'm very interested in the oldest son in this family. Because in my experience, an oldest son sometimes has to be the one that goes off into the world first and doesn't do it quite right. And it seems to me, and then I might make my comment based on what's going on in the family, but I'm contextualizing my perspective such that they can either reject or accept my perspective based on the history of who I am and how they would see me. If I just said, the oldest son, it doesn't give them a sense of sort of where I'm coming from. So the reflecting team is reflecting what's going on in the family. And in the original form of it, it was done behind a one-way mirror. What ended up happening, though, is it changed, and the one-way mirror was taken away, and it evolved to the reflecting team sitting around, sort of in an island around. So here's the reflecting team. Now sitting around in the same room. So we have the family and the therapist talking about a problem going on in the family. There's a break. The team says, the therapist says, now I'd like to wait a second and have the team talk about what we've just been talking about. The family and therapist stop, and the team now has contextualized conversation about what is going on here. The team has their conversation. The family listens to it. There's a break. The family now talks about what the team just said about them. There is no conversation between the two. Imagine that wall is still in place with the one-way mirror. But by bringing them further into the room and actually having them be real people sitting and sort of observing the process, there's more of an engagement occurring. And at the same time, it's allowing for what would you call, when someone pulls back to a meta perspective, there's a meta conversation occurring. So what we're doing is we're mirroring for the family from the reflecting team the capacity to step back and outside of themselves and really look at what it is their behavior or their process is like to people watching it. And so you start flipping it back and forth so that now the family becomes meta to the reflecting team. The reflecting team becomes meta to the family, being meta to the how back and forth, and it's a very interesting conversation. Yes?
Was the team designed to sort of correlate to the structure of the family? So that there was like an older son, like if there were children? Okay.
No, but in order to speak, you would have to you would have to bring something of yourself, okay? Which again, now that becomes interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now we're jumping ahead, but it becomes interesting because it starts bringing in a much more real, a much more almost collaborative element, which is why you see that Anderson comes out of the collaborative language, okay? Because what he ends up, you have to speak more as a therapist, okay? But we'll talk about that more. I just want to go to the next. Go ahead.
Does the therapist talk to the reflecting team?
No conversation between the two.
So then, does the therapist just kind of step back out of that, or does the therapist
Nope, the therapist.
talk to the family?
Nope, the therapist then says, okay, so they think as an oldest son, you have a hard time. That one therapist that just talked from the team was really somehow empathetic to your plight or sympathetic to your plight in the family. So the therapist would reference what the team member said but not talk directly to.
So the therapist then just kind of becomes, I don't know.
A facilitator. Sort of, if you will, I don't believe that there's a term for this, but I'll make it up now, a meta-facilitator. Okay? A meta-facilitator. Okay, so that's the reflecting team. And then we also have the Milan systemic team. And the Milan systemic team is very different, where we have a therapist and a family who call up the Milan team and they want to come in for a meta consultation. Now, these were done oftentimes once a month. And what ends up happening is that the team then meets and they get information from the person that took the phone call from the therapist. The therapist is not a part of this team that comes in. And they start hypothesizing. Okay? So what this family and therapist come in, and now what's really interesting with the Milan model is that the therapist and family are now the treatment unit. The therapist is no longer outside of the treatment unit. They are now part of the client system in a meta-consultation model. And what ends up happening is that the therapist then and family are interviewed by anyone know? Co-therapy team with a male and a female therapist coming in. Okay, why?
So it makes it neutral.
Yes, exactly. This is how they address the issue of neutrality. Okay, the male and female co-therapist end up sort of making sure that there's equal kind of, we talked about it yesterday in terms of object relations, projective identification going on between the gender roles. Okay? It's because, sometimes you're going to connect more with someone of the same sex, sometimes you're going to connect more with someone of the opposite sex. The point being is it gives them that, it sort of takes care of the gender biases. What ends up happening then is that with this team, they come in and they do an interview, they further hypothesize, then they come back, and then the team starts working on the hypothesis. And we won't go into that because we're not talking about Milan yet. But those are the three kinds of teams. Okay? Direct interventional, reflecting team, and the Milan team.
Is that the Greek chorus?
The Greek chorus comes as well from the Milan team in terms of how they then present the information they're trying to put back and forth. For instance, they might say with the Greek chorus, all the men on the team believe this, or all the women or the people over 50 on the team think that, or right, they can play with the chorus behind the team. The other thing that happened with the Milan team too is that sometimes they would put together an O team. Remember we talked about what were we talking about? Rippling from family to this interface to this in here, something called an isomorphism. Okay, this is the team that addresses the isomorphs in attempting to try to figure that out. Okay, good. So that's just those teams, and we'll just finish up the MRI model now. Okay, so the stance of the therapist is active, and we use teams. We're looking for the most motivated person. We're going to focus on symptoms. There'll be tasks in session as well, but most of it change happens out of session. We use paradox. And we're having a lot of enactment and having people interact with each other in that therapy. We're looking at sequential behaviors, vicious cycles. We're trying to change those behaviors. And what we're trying to do is, again, only focus on symptom relief. Okay? Presenting problem is what we focus on. When we've addressed that, we're done. It's non-historic. We don't care what happened 2 or 3 or 1 generation ago. And we're oftentimes paying attention to the circular causality of what? The symptom maintenance, okay, which is actually, Monty, exactly that. It's the homeostasis. Okay? So we're looking for the homeostasis around the vicious cycle. We're going to introduce a series of positive feedback loops, typically trying to either address it just with a first-order change or bump it up to a second-order change where we're changing the rules or the belief system through using paradox and the like.
And it's the hope that the first order change will create a change in perception leading to the second order change?
You don't have to necessarily have a change of perception. All you care about is having the customer get rid of the symptom they came in with in their presenting problem. There's no bias towards second order belief system changes. It's just they have that available to them if they need to dig a little deeper in their tool bag or engineer with a bigger wrench. Okay? We wrench change. We can make anybody change using this model. It's where you can then see where this, all of a sudden we're starting as therapists in our training to feel, hey, we can do a lot. We're kind of powerful. Okay? So in the history of family therapy, we're starting to feel that we have some muscle and we can really generate change. Now we're going to move to J. Haley's strategic model. Okay? And this is a model with Haley and Madonis. And remember that they were married for a time. And Haley traveled from where? He traveled from MRI. So his roots are really based on Gregory Bateson's work. He then traveled from, if you can track him across the country, he went from Palo Alto. Though why would anyone ever leave Palo Alto? Have you ever been to Palo Alto? Oh, Monterey. Anyway, he left there for Phoenix. And he hung out with Milton Erickson for a year. That was the basis of his writing his book, Uncommon Therapy, which, again, I highly recommend you get and read. It's a great book. And then he moved across country to Washington, D.C., started the Family Institute. And there, down the road, met Salvador Minuchin. Okay? So the influences of Haley are, again, Bateson, Erickson, and Minuchin. Okay? J. Haley, anyone ever meet J. Haley? Or no, he was a very tall, a gangly almost gentleman who, when he would enter a room, you got a sense that he was going to be in control of what was going on. So that you can see his sort of movement towards the importance of hierarchy probably came a bit from who he was and how he looked at the world. So when we think of Haley, we immediately think of hierarchy. So Haley, hierarchy. Okay? And when we think of MRI, we think of, just to go over it again, engineered fast food. Well, I guess fast food is engineered these days, isn't it? Okay? So Haley is now coming in, and he's really looking at sort of how rules govern. You got my Rhode Island accent, it slipped out. I'm usually pretty good. How rules govern hierarchy. Okay? Which means what? We're going to be sort of moving towards the metastructures in a family, the belief systems that really hold hierarchy in place. He's always paying attention to that. Haley's, perhaps one of his most significant books was the book called Problem-Solving Therapy. And if you can't remember what Haley does, always go back to that title, Problem-Solving Therapy. Okay? In Problem-Solving Therapy, there was a very important chapter on the structured initial interview. Now, were I a test question writer on this exam, I think it's so important that you would be able to understand what that was and be able to evidence that you understood that. In my day, we were trained to replicate that. What are the steps of the structured initial interview? Does anyone know? There are 4 stages of it. First is the social stage. Now, what happens in the social stage?
You really join the family and create an atmosphere of trust.
Okay. And how might so you join the family and create an atmosphere of trust. How might J. Haley do that? He would go around the room. Yep, he'd go around the room and make some kind of contact and make some, we might talk about, the dad's wearing a golf shirt and asks him, does he play golf? The mom, has, sort of a legal pad or a briefcase, and what kind of work do you do? The son has scuffed sneakers and says, do you ride a bike? Right? He's going to look for something in particular that's going to allow a personal connection, a joining. Okay? One of the things that I think about whenever I hear the word joining, I immediately jump to generic family therapy. Okay? Because this is a concept that obviously runs across most of our models of marriage and family therapy. And so joining Joining is a sort of what I would say it's an intermediate stage of the engagement process. I first think of entering a system. So if you guys are my family, and I knock on the door, this is how I love to talk about this. Anybody remember the Fuller Brush Man? The Fuller Brush Man? Okay. No, this is an old part of the way life was. Okay, we used to have the Fuller Brush Man. We used to have a guy come around and sharpen your knives and scissors. Ring a bell. Remember that? Okay. It's life as it used to be. The Fuller Brush Man would knock on your door, and he had a brush for everything. He had brushes for baby bottles. He had toothbrushes. He had brushes for places in engines that you needed to go 3 different directions at once to get. He had it, and he could design it for you. But anyway, when the Fuller Brush Man knocks on the door, what happens in your family growing up? Is he let inside the door?
Yes.
Is he kept outside of the door? Did you peek through a hole? They didn't have holes in those days, did they? But the point being is there's a familial boundary that we all have around our family, and we decide, do we let people in or not? Okay? When you first meet a family, you have to enter, and you enter and you cross over that boundary. With a referral phone call, we are entering over that boundary. Okay? Once this contact made, we start entering. Now, once we have entered and been allowed to get inside that familial boundary, what ends up happening? We then have to start our process as therapists to join. And this is the stage that we're talking about as the social stage in Haley's model. So we're able to join, and we're going to have some kind of connection where we are really developing a trusting relationship between ourselves and all the different members of the client system. We have to join with everyone. We have to join with the different subsystems even, too, don't we? Okay? We have to join, like, for instance, if you're working with a family with adolescents, you have to have a slice of irreverence to who you are in order to connect with the adolescents. If you're joining with parents, you have to be a bit on the side of authority, depending, of course, on how that family is organized, in order to join with that sort of level of the family subsystem of the parents. So once there's sufficient joining, and we test joining, don't we? We test to see, are they going to actually listen to me? Are they going to accept what I have to say? If we haven't joined effectively and sufficiently, we have to sort of go back and join again. Once we have joined completely, we are then, in my words, engaged. And when we're engaged with a family system, what do? We can then make a demand upon that family system to do something out of the ordinary, to step outside of the normal way they would approach things and try something new. So generically, and again, this is just something to sort of add to your notes in terms of the generic model, generically, that whole engagement process has the entering facet, the joining facet, and then the engaged facet. If you make an attempt to ask someone to do something out of the ordinary and they don't do it, what do? And they say, no, I'm not going to do it. You go back to joining because you haven't sufficiently joined. So Haley's going to join with each of these people in the family system. And then he moves to what? So there's joining first, problem identification or identifying the problem. And what's he going to look at? First of all, what they tell him. Okay, why are you here? How they define the problem. Okay, and then he's going to look for what? He's going to look for evidence. Remember, he comes from the MRI model. He's not going to use the word vicious cycle, is he? But he's going to look for the behavioral sequences that support the definition of the problem. In a sense, he's going to look for the negative feedback loops or the homeostasis or the circularity or the what the family's doing that somehow maintains that problem. After which, he then goes to the enactment stage or the interactional stage, okay, where he's going to ask the family to then enact the problem. Now, how would we describe that kind of a technique, his enacting the problem? What would that be? If you guys are my family, and I have identified, but you've told me what the problem is. Okay, so you come to me and you tell me, we're not passing this test. Okay, we're here to your therapy, Rob, because we're not passing the test. And I say, okay, so show me what you're doing. Okay, I want you to show me exactly how you're studying and preparing for this test. In a sense, we're kind of doing that, aren't we? Okay? And what is my job as a Haley therapist then? Okay, is to really identify what is going on that maintains the problem sequence Okay? And then I'm going to set some goals based on that. Okay? Now, if I'm Haley, however, once I use all my strategic techniques and we set goals and we alleviate that problem sequence, and again, I'm going to use many of Erickson's, or I'm going to use a lot of the MRI techniques, or I'm going to bring in Madonis's use of ordeals, okay, which what ends up adding an onerous aspect, makes it more difficult to maintain the problem. We'll talk about that in a second. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to step back and then do my organizational component and look at the rules that govern the hierarchy. So the first stage of the therapy is going to be the structured initial interview, and we're going to do that repeatedly until we alleviate the problem. Then we're going to back up and we're going to reorganize the family around hierarchy. Am I going to look at boundaries with Haley? No. Am I going to look at subsystems other than the executive subsystem? No. Am I going to look at things like equifinality or equipotentiality? No. All I'm going to look at in terms of organization is the hierarchy. Okay? Who's the person that looks at the full organizational structure? Minuchin. Okay? So Haley is going to view the presenting problem as being what? A metaphor, okay, for the actual problem. Okay, he's going to see it as a metaphor. He's going to see it as having some kind of symbolic representation. I'm not sure you remember, but Haley was very interested in the dreams of schizophrenics. And so that kind of symbolism was also always very interesting to him. Okay? What does he want to see in families? He wants to see flexibility in families, and he's going to work on having the families be much more flexible. Okay? Madonis adds in, again, the notion that there is a connection that between love and violence, that there's somewhat of an interplay between love and violence. Her use of ordeals is particularly interesting. Can anyone talk about what an ordeal is, or give an example of what an ordeal might be in therapy? For instance, let's say that we have a mother and daughter, and the daughter jumps, well, those of us that have kids, remember that stage when our kids didn't want to stay in bed? Yes. And they jump out, and they're going to jump in bed with us? Okay. Now, it can be a little tricky. And what ends up happening is that what Madonis would do in a situation like that is what? How could she make that or turn that into an ordeal? Let's say the kid gets up every 30 minutes. You put the child down, and they get up all night long. What would Madonis do to turn that into an ordeal? Now remember, it's going to be strategic and paradoxical. So she's probably going to do what? Prescribe the symptom, but what?
If they're a little older,
Getting out every 10 minutes.
Have them do, okay, you could have them get up and actually have to do homework for a half hour and then go back to bed again. And if they get up again, do homework. Okay? But they would have, actually, what she would do too is she would have the mother wake the kid up every 30 minutes. So now it's a pain in the neck for her too, because remember, we're paying attention to the recursiveness or the circularity of it all. And we're not going to say that it's just the kid that's getting up. The mother's probably signaling a little bit of the behavior as well on some level, or part of it, or the dad is too if he's involved. Now, anyone ever hear of Ferberizing, the Ferber technique, working with little kids that jump out of bed? It's sort of like again with a 2-year-old who doesn't want to stay in their own bed once they get out of the crib, and they just keep running out and they don't go to sleep. What Ferber came up with was this notion that you have to sort of hold the kids in their room by shutting the door and not letting the kid open the door. So you have to take everything out that could be dangerous in the room, and you leave the kid in the door. The kid's going to have a tantrum, and eventually it's going to they're going to get tired, they're going to fall asleep, and you're going to break the pattern. But what's really interesting about that technique is that the real issue is not going on inside the room with the kid having the tantrum. It's what's going on with mom and dad outside the door fighting over, no, I want to go in. No, you can't. No, you. That's where the work goes, but that speaks to the recursiveness of it. And so Haley and Madonis are always paying attention to sort of, again, what's the circularity of what's maintaining the symptom as well. So with that child getting out of bed, it's important that the mom also have an element that's a little onerous as well when you're creating an ordeal. So the difference between an ordeal and a ritual, since they're kind of similar, is what? An ordeal has the onerous component, whereas a ritual is what? What's a ritual? Anybody have any rituals in their lives? Say it again? A birthday cake? Okay. Getting a birthday cake could be a ritual. Anyone, you know when Thanksgiving comes around? Does anybody else have that Jello mold salad that comes every single Thanksgiving? We have cranberries and walnuts in ours.
Cream cheese.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, but the point is that we have certain kind of rituals that get repeated from year to year. Well, rituals, we have rituals in, sort of our everyday life too. Maybe getting up and having a cup of coffee could be a ritual. Maybe my wife and I say, if we're having a fight, we're not going to go to bed angry, and we try to hold that as a ritual. So even if we're in struggle, we'd say we're going to try to work this out before we go to bed and not go to bed angry. That's a bit of a ritual. A ritual raises something to a level of importance and significance that's beyond the ordinary. And so it draws our attention to it, and it has a sort of, in a sense, it pulls us back to a meta perspective on whatever that behavior is. We're kind of pulling back from that. So rituals, and when we think of rituals, who do we think of? Milan systemic a little bit, but the person that I jump out at with it is the idea of Evan Imber Black. Sometimes she's known as Evan Imber. Sometimes she's known as Evan Black. Sometimes she's known as Evan Imber Black. She went through some. It probably is worth being aware that Evan Imber Black she comes from the structural model, but really did a lot of work on rituals, odd day, even day rituals. You may have used those at different times. Evan Imber Black. Okay? And Imber is I-M-B-E-R. But that's the structural model, so shift it over to the structural. Okay, so what does Haley do in his work? He aligns with the parental hierarchy. And he's trying to have the parental hierarchy, okay, the parent system, or the couple system, address whatever the problems are with the kids. So that the parents become the problem solvers in working with it, with the kids. Theory of dysfunction, the symptoms are maintained by the family's unsuccessful problem-solving efforts. Again, what does that sound like? The attempted solution's the problem. Okay? And there's an inability to adjust to life cycle transitions. Again, this is a model that does what? That really emphasizes that the node from one life cycle stage to the next is where problems emerge. And honestly, and I'm sure if all of us think about that in our own lives, isn't that sort of a place where we get into difficulty? When we have to make a real transition in terms of how we organize and how we do things, it's much easier to just sort of keep things the same, but that's when people hold on tightly to things being the same, sometimes problems emerge. There's a dysfunctional hierarchy, so he's going to work on how the couple system co-parents or co-leads, and he's also going to look for triangulation or coalitions. Now, coalition is a word, when I think of it, Haley uses it, but I think of it more in terms of the structural model. Okay? And just quickly, the distinction between a coalition and an alliance is what?
Coalition, they're sort of working together. Alliance is they're sort of conspiring against.
Just the opposite. And an alliance, so we have an alliance towards something positive. Okay? So alliances tend to be at the same subsystem level or generational level. A coalition crosses a generational boundary and is against someone. And again, this is a bit more structural, but again, that's one of the borrowings that Haley brought from Minuchin. We're looking to increase flexibility, and we're really looking for both developmental and non-developmental change. So the developmental change would speak to those life cycle transitions. Non-developmental change would speak to the particulars of how the family is stuck and how we're going to problem solve around that. We're only going to reestablish hierarchy. We're not going to adjust anything else in the family organizational structure, just hierarchy. And similar to the MRI model, what do? We just get rid of the presenting problem. That's all we're looking for. We're not looking to go beyond that. So we talked about initially, we're going to do the structured initial interview in every therapy. We're going to start that way. Then we're going to establish the goals. We're going to repeat the sequence of interactions. We're going to see it. We're going to intervene. We're going to possibly cycle through this 2 or 3 times till we get symptom relief. We're going to end. Therapy is also brief. Okay. Stance of the therapist. Very, very active, very sort of clearly in charge, very intentional. They're going to join well with the family. Joining is essential in this model. And they, like the MRI model, though probably not quite as much. I put the MRI a little bit more on the continuum for responsibility for change, but they hold full responsibility for change in the therapy. Focus is only going to be on the presenting problem, and there's going to be an emphasis on really using the language of the family. So part of the joining process is really to learn the language of the family. And when we start using the words and the way the family talks about things, using their sort of way of representing the actual sort of situations or reality in their family, that furthers the joining process. Okay? And we're also obviously a very active observer. What kind of techniques? He's going to use all the paradoxical interventions. And anyone know that, well, actually, I think we talk about this in a second, the difference between reframing and relabeling? We'll talk about that in a sec. Restraint from change. What's an example of restraining from change? Restraint of change.
Don't change too quickly. Let's slow things down.
That would be a go slow, which is a form of a restraint of change. I'm thinking that I'm thinking that if you, I realize you're depressed, but I'm worried that if you start feeling better too quickly or at all, I'm afraid it's going to hurt your health. And so I would not like you to actually do what you've just proposed, because I think the change in the euphoria that might come over you is going to be too hard for you to handle. And people are going to not really see you as you really are or have been, and you're going to have to deal with all these people wanting to talk with you and have a better relationship with you, and I think it's going to overwhelm you, and it's going to just be too much. Now, obviously, there's a serious tongue in my cheek when I'm saying that. Okay? But you end up framing things at that level, okay, in terms of a restraint from change. Change may be too dangerous. And again, that sets up that therapeutic paradox or that double bind where it becomes a win-win. If they listen to you, you win. If they oppose you, they change. Go slow techniques, prescribing the symptom. And what is there, do we never see here? Positive connotation, okay? There is never any positive connotation going on, because positive connotation only is in the Milan systemic model. Okay, we're going to use in-session enactment, feedback on what's going on in the session, and we're also going to bring in ordeals at times to make it very onerous to maintain whatever the symptom is. So let's look at, just for a second, the difference between reframing and relabeling. Okay, so what do you see in this picture? Okay, so we have a person bending over, trying to touch his toes, and seemingly is having frustration or a lot of sweat dripping. And what ends up happening, so that becomes what? What is going on inside the actual behavior, okay? And that would be a reframing, that would be sort of a labeling of what the behavior is. We have to label what the behavior is. When we reframe, when we relabel, we move to the actual sort of behavior inside. And a labeling is really speaking to the meta sort of understanding of what is going on. So what might be the meta frame of this? If we pull back and speak to it from a much more meta level. Any thoughts? Okay, so the labeling is that the man can't touch his toes. Okay, and when we go back to a reframing, is there is a man, there's a frustrated man. This man is frustrated. There's a relabeling of sort of, or reframing of sort of how he deals with frustration. He gets very worked up with this frustration. So a label, let's, for instance, if we label the teen, there's a daughter that's having difficulty because she's depressed. So we label why the girl's not going to school. We shift it over. The frame in the larger, from a meta perspective, is that this is a medical problem. We move out to a more meta level. The label is she refuses to go to school. This is a family or school problem. So we're sort of relabeling and we're pulling back to sort of label it in a much more contextual, or not, and I say contextual not in the contextual sense, but speaking to the context that the behavior is going on in and what kind of a problem is. So we're moving back to a further meta level. Haley also, again, when he's assessing families, he's using a non-historic sense. He's really looking at what's going on in the session. He's going to assess the family life cycle. He's going to look for those transition points or nodes. He's going to use a lot of data that emanates from self-reporting. He's always going to look at the hierarchy. He's going to look at how the family's interacting with each other. And he's going to see what happens when he intervenes, how the family actually responds to his interventions. Okay? Any questions about Haley? Yes?
I did not get the reframing versus relabeling.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to that slide. Hold on one sec. Okay, so the man here is exercising. Okay, that's the behavior. Okay? This is the actual label of the behavior. Okay, so the label happens at a more discrete level in terms of the actual behavior or the sequence of behavior. Okay? What might a frame of this be?
Perhaps he has back problems.
Okay. This is an exercise for back problems. Okay? Or this is how we dress for gym. Okay? It speaks to a much, we don't look at the behavior of the individual, we look at sort of what kind of an issue, what kind of a thing this is. Okay? So we're looking at the frame, again the frame part, of what this behavior is. And so that we're adding a meaning at a meta level to what that person might be doing. And this is where, again, this is where the belief system in a family, when we move to sort of reframing something, we're sort of changing the meaning or the belief system about it. If I say to you, this is an ad for Converse sneakers, that's a very different statement than this is an example of how you touch your toes, or this is what happens when this person gets frustrated. He tends to get very worked up. There's a way of pulling back to sort of creating a lens through which you're going to look through in order to understand what the behavior is. And that becomes sort of a second order perception. Okay, because we're looking at sort of the meaning or the belief system that underlies how you're viewing it. Yes?
So if a family comes into therapy, I've always thought of reframing as being a way of, say, Johnny's been skipping school and smoking weed or something, and the family comes into therapy, and a reframe could possibly be, Johnny's acted in this way, and in some ways this is a good thing because, look, it brought you all into therapy. And it's sort of reframing the behavior so that the family can see it in a different way. Is that? But I don't understand how
relabeling would go to the specifics of what he's doing in regards to skipping the school. Okay.
How would you relabel that?
Johnny's bored in the morning. Johnny's really bored in the morning, and we're somehow we have to somehow find a way to engage him in the process of getting to school. Or he's, but it's looking more to the specifics. So that the reframing, again, the key here is that the reframe is really creating a different meaning to what the behavior is. Relabeling is sort of just playing with the behavior itself.
So instead of he's lazy in school, maybe he's bored.
He's bored in school would be a relabel of that. But then you reframe, adding a much more sort of involved meaning level or shift in the belief system. Okay.
In the next module, we will finish looking at the strategic modules by turning our attention to the Milan systemic model.